Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old school type of vintage racers. But right now we're going to take a look at a bike that gained almost iconic status when it was seen ridden by a Hollywood film star in the early 1970s in that epic film documentary by Bruce Brown, On Any Sunday. But of course the bike we're talking about here is the mighty 400 Cross Husqvarna. Now this is a bike that I came across at the recent Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, so what we're going to do now is dive straight into that video and take a look at this lovely restored example of one of these iconic machines. Now there certainly are a very small handful of motocrossers from the early 1970s that have shaped the face of modern off-road dirt bike racing, certainly for the good of the sport, and the mighty 1974 or even 75 Honda 250 Elsinore is just one of those machines that immediately springs to mind. But one of the other iconic scrambles race bikes of that same era has to be these Swedish-built 400 Cross Husqvarnas, a bike that not only attained cult status when Steve McQueen was seen riding a similar model in Bruce Brown's epic film documentary On Any Sunday, these 400 Cross Husqvarnas also took Swedish rider Bengt Aberg to 2 world titles in 1969 and 1970. So anyhow, the story goes regarding our particular 400 Cross Husky is that this is basically a stock 1971 bike that's undergone a complete restoration, which was a way back in 2013, and since then this bike has been dry stored for the last 10 years or so before it was once again revealed to the public and offered up for sale at the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Now, some of the information that I received on the day that I grabbed these video clips were that this bike was fully restored by Husqvarna bike building legend Will Bennett, and the bike has been put back to almost brand new condition, and it was advertised on the day of the show for £12,000, although whether anybody had that kind of cash in their back pocket on the day and drove it away, I don't actually know. Although in terms of the build of their chassis, these Swedish-made Husqvarna frames were very unlike the many British-manufactured motorcycle chassis of the 1960s. These Husky frames were made from light-gauge tubular steel, and they were super light and very strong, and certainly not the same heavy steeled chassis that you found on some of those big British bikes of that era, which in the main were quite heavy and cumbersome and certainly not easy to throw around a motocross track, whereas these Husky chassis were the complete opposite, because they were super light, strong and very easy to throw around. So combine that with a good, strong, powerful 2-stroke motor and you are certainly, without doubt, onto a winner. But I'm sure you're already aware that these 400 Cross Husky motors were certainly as tough as old boots, and they did work well for just a simple piston port 2-stroke motor that allegedly put out around the 40 horsepower mark. But back in 1967 or even 68, these Husky power plants were just 360 cc, and the frame also in those years was just a simple bolt together type of affair, although the 360 engine did suffer slightly from lack of grunt, and riders were forever asking Husqvarna for more horsepower from their off-roaders. And so it was in 1969 that they launched this 400cc engine with a much better one-piece tubular steel chassis. But certainly these 1971 Cross motors, some people say, were among some of the best Husky Cross models of their time, and this engine here had a 4-speed gearbox, which, as I remember, I think was upgraded to a 5-speed in 1972, which some people say were heavier and really didn't handle as well as these 71 bikes. But as long as you kept on top of any maintenance issues and keeping it regularly serviced, this was still a pure belter of an engine. But visually, the 360 and even the 400 Husky motors looked almost identical at first glance, and they say a common method of identifying which engine you had was to try and place your thumb between the top of the cylinder and the bottom of the cylinder head, and if your thumb fitted in between the two in the gap, then you had a 400 motor, and if it didn't, then of course it was just a 360. But normally these 400s did have a bore of 81 millimeters and a stroke of around 76 millimeters, and it was usually fueled by a decent sized 36 millimeter Bing carburetor as well. And once again, the 1971 Husky 400 Cross, as you can see, had this one-piece, very sensible looking up and over the engine type of exhaust pipe that then led onto a tailpipe that extended along this left-hand side of the frame, that certainly could warm up your leg sufficiently if it was a cold day on the racetrack. But it was a big bore pipe, very practical, and because it was tucked up high on the bike, it never really suffered any of the kind of damage normally encountered by bikes with those low slung exhaust systems. Although, as I said, these 400 Cross Husky motors were fantastic engines that were again quite light but very powerful, and when they were set up correctly they could certainly keep up and often beat bikes of a much larger capacity, with of course the right rider in the saddle. But as the 1970s progressed, more and more competition was coming in from Japan, and of course it wouldn't be too long before our 400 Crossers were then resigned to the history books. So the front suspension on our 400 Cross Husky was again quite good for 1971, but naturally the forks on these Huskies weren't as well engineered or even high tech as we have nowadays, but for an early 1970s design, these were still good enough to compete with other similar sized dirt bikes of that period. Now, at the rear end of our bike, it was just a very simple pair of dampers, which I'm pretty sure were Girling shocks back in 1971, and as you can gather, these were very basic units with almost no means of adjustment or tuning. Also here at the back end of our bike, it has its original Acront alloy wheels from that year, laced of course onto the Husqvarna rear hub with its old school drum brakes, which as I remember were quite good stoppers for their day, because even for a 400cc dirt bike, this still wasn't a heavy machine, around 230 pounds, so it was still relatively easy to slow it down or stop it, even for one of these antique drum braking systems. Now this of course is one of the parts that make these iconic dirt bikes instantly recognisable by these red fuel tanks with of course that polished or chromed-like feature on either side, which I think was originally designed to stop the rider's legs rubbing away the fancy paintwork. But the fuel tank was certainly made of alloy, and it held a decent amount of gas, because many of these 400 crossers were used for desert racing. So as you'd expect, you needed a decent fuel capacity, because naturally there wouldn't be a gas station every 10 miles along your route. And once again, as you can see, proper old school alloy mudguards on these Husqvarnas, because these naturally were the days before modern plastics were being used on off-road bikes, and in my opinion these alloy parts look much better than plastic anyhow. Although I'm pretty sure that these 71 Cross Huskies did have a little mud flap here at the front of this mudguard in that year to try and help deflect mud and debris from hitting the rider, but I expect that those kind of original parts are probably now almost impossible to find in this modern day. But it was a very comfortable seat that was fitted onto these Huskies in that year, when many other manufacturers of that time tended to keep their motorcycle motocross seats quite slim and minimal, but not Husqvarna, who made this seat and this 400 Cross model a very comfortable ride. But without doubt, this bike's builder and restorer, Will Bennett, has certainly made a fantastic job of bringing this bike back to its almost as new condition, because it does appear to have most of all of the correct controls and other parts that it would have had back in 1971 when it left Husky HQ in Sweden. And as you can see, it still has its original Magura levers and grips, although that little black engine kill switch there is maybe a later fitment. But you certainly needed a steady hand on this throttle twist grip to keep control of the 40 or so Husky horses that were waiting to be let loose on that 400 two-stroke motor. Although when you continue to look around this bike, it's quite hard to find any fault with any of the parts regarding its restoration, because most of the parts certainly look like as they should be for one of these iconic 400 Cross race bikes. And these Steve McQueen on any Sunday models are getting harder and harder to find as the years roll by, which is why you never ever see them on tracks nowadays, because anybody that's lucky enough to own one just wants to keep it all tucked up, safe and sound, to remember those great days and the history of these once legendary motorcycles. And when Hollywood film star Steve McQueen was seen riding one of these machines in Bruce Brown's epic film documentary in 1971, it seemed that everybody, and including their dog, wanted a 400 Cross Husqvarna, and the Swedish Husky factory at that time were selling them before they'd even made them. And as I previously mentioned, Will Bennett has certainly made a cracking job of bringing this iconic machine back to life again. A restoration, I might add, that was, as I said, carried out back in 2013, and the bike's been dry stored in an air-conditioned capsule for the last 10 years. Now, I don't actually know if anybody did eventually pay the £12,000 asking price on the day, which maybe to some people might sound a bit steep, but believe me, these 400 Cross models are only going to increase in value as the years tick by, and let's face it, if you're an off-road motorcycle enthusiast, who wouldn't want this little beauty as pride and place in your motorcycle collection? Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed having a look around that fully restored version of 1971 400 Cross Husqvarna, a bike, as I said, that gained almost iconic status when a similar model to that was seen being ridden by legendary Hollywood film star Steve McQueen on Bruce Brown's epic film documentary On Any Sunday. Now, coming up next year on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, we'll be showcasing all of the bikes and, of course, all of the trackside action from the recent Scottish Classic Round 5 event that was held at Bassenthwaite in Cumbria last weekend. So make sure that you don't miss out on that next video that I'm going to post, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my CDB channel, and I do hope you will consider doing that very small thing in order that you don't miss out on any future videos that I post. But from everybody here at the CDB HQ, it's goodbye for now.